Hey students, Mr. White here. I'm going to give you one last semester exam review video that you can watch like while you're at the bus stop, before you go to bed, when you wake up, the day before you come in for the test, the day of the test. You can even watch it after the test just to see how you did. So let's get going. Pay attention to everything I'm going to say. First thing, we talked about exploration and colonization. Europeans set out from Europe and started conquering vast swaths of the New World in North and South America. So the Spanish conquered a huge territory. They came to build missions and convert natives to Catholicism, and they also came for gold and money and any kind of riches. They wanted to expand their empire. Now, the English came over for two primary reasons. One of them was for religious freedom because they were being persecuted in England. And the second reason was to make money, and they did this by farming cash crops. All right. The French, they came over here and inhabited the Ohio River Valley and parts of Canada and down the Mississippi River, and they did that for the fur trade. So they were trying to find these nice fur coats. So when we're still talking about this, American colonists had to set up their own governments because England was too far away. And every time you hear the Mayflower Compact, the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, or the Virginia House of Burgesses, I want you to automatically think self-government or representative government. All right. And we know that the Mayflower Compact was the first written agreement for self-government in the colonies. The Fundamental Orders of Connecticut was that first written constitution. And the Virginia House of Burgesses was the first colonial assembly. And they did this all for the purposes of self-governing. They needed to govern themselves on a smaller level. All right. So we've talked about the terrain and the climate and how it affected how colonists in the 13 English colonies made money. So we look up at New England, and I drew the snowman in here just so you would kind of remember, hey, the further north you go in the northern hemisphere, the colder it gets, and they have rocky soil and long winters, so it's not good for growing. They had to do things like cut down timber and build things like ships, and they did a lot of fishing up there, and that's how they made their money, and they became like the merchants of the colonies. Now, in the southern colonies, where the sun is down south, they have shorter winters, they have good soil, and it's good for growing these cash crops. So that was their economy, and it was a slave labor-based economy. So after the French and Indian War, we start transitioning into our Revolutionary era, and the British needed to pay off their debt from the French and Indian War, so they enacted certain things, taxes, and we call them acts and duties, to try to pay off that war debt. We had the Stamp Act, the Tea Act, the Townshend Acts, we had the Quartering Acts. We get the Boston Massacre, and then we have some more protests, and one of these actually ends up in an act of what we call civil disobedience because of these taxation policies, and that was the Boston Tea Party, when 300 and something casks of tea were dumped into the Boston Harbor, which it causes the Intolerable Acts, which leads directly to war. And we have the fighting at Lexington and Concord, the Battle of Saratoga, which is called the Turning Point, the Battle of Yorktown, which was the final battle, and this leads to the Treaty of Paris, where the Americans gained their independence from England and became their own nation. Now, they had set up a government during the Revolutionary time because they knew they were going to win, and they were like, hey, let's go ahead and get things together. But they created this government very weak. It was a loose confederation of states because they feared a strong ruler and a strong government, so they really did make it weak on purpose. And one of those weaknesses was the big government could not tax the citizens. They also kind of miffed the voting rights. They only gave each state one vote in Congress. There's quite a few weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, but let's talk about one of the strengths. The Northwest Ordinance that creates the process for admitting new states into the Union. So this is a way to create new states from territories, and you get those 60,000 people. You got your local government, you write your constitution, you apply for statehood, and you become a state. Now, what proved that the Articles of Confederation didn't work was this thing called Shays' Rebellion, when farmers in Massachusetts overthrew an arsenal and tried to overthrow a courthouse, and the federal government was too weak to take out these guys. So Shays' Rebellion really told the founding fathers, hey, we need to fix this. Let's have a constitutional convention. And we get to that constitutional convention, and there's a few compromises that are important. The Great Compromise creates a bicameral legislature, which means two houses, and that just says, hey, there's going to be a Senate, and every state gets two senators, And then there's going to be a House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives is based on the population of the state. And we get the 3/5 compromise, which counted 3/5 of a state's slave population to gain more representation in that lower house, or the House of Representatives. There's also the Commerce Compromise. It says no export taxes on goods going out of the country, but there will also be no laws on slavery for 20 years. All right. Now, to get this Constitution ratified, there was a bunch of debates. We have the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists, they wanted a strong central government, and they thought that the Bill of Rights was not necessary. They said, we don't need a Bill of Rights. It's all in Article 4 of the Constitution, which we'll get to in a minute. The Anti-Federalists, they feared a strong government and said that the Constitution needs that Bill of Rights in it. And they wrote these articles called the Federalist Papers and published them in newspapers. And eventually, the Federalists do get the Constitution passed or ratified, but not without the Anti-Federalists also helping get that Bill of Rights put into it. So when we look at the actual makeup of the Constitution, we have the Article 1, which is the legislative branch. Article 2 is the executive branch, and it outlines all the powers of the president. Article 3 is that judicial branch, which outlines the powers of the Supreme Court. Article 4 states it's all about the states and the citizens' rights. So that's where the Federalists said that the rights of the citizens were already listed, but it doesn't really outline them specifically. Article 5 is all about the amendment process, and we get it's a two-step process. So Congress on the national level has to recommend has to put the amendment out on the table and say, hey, this is what we want to do, and they have to approve it there. And then it goes down to the states, and 3/4 of the states have to actually vote for it in order for the amendment to be ratified. So it takes both the federal and the state level to amend the Constitution. So it's very hard to do. Article 6 tells all about the constitutional authority, like the authority of the Constitution, saying it's going to be the supreme law of the land. And Article 7 is about ratifying the Constitution. And we get to our Bill of Rights, and we know the First Amendment protects us from religious persecution, lets us worship whoever and however you want without persecution. You get freedom of speech. You get the freedom to peacefully assemble. You get the freedom to petition your government for change, and you get freedom of press, or you can write things, publish things about the government, and that's okay as long as it's factual. Second Amendment gives you the right to bear arms, to keep and maintain weapons. Third Amendment, no quartering of soldiers. The Fourth Amendment protects you from improper search and seizure of your personal belongings. Fifth Amendment is the right to remain silent, no double jeopardy, or you can't be charged with a crime twice. Fair payment for seized land, so if the government takes your land, they have to pay you justly for it. The Sixth Amendment is the right to a fair, speedy jury trial in a criminal case. You also get the right to call witnesses and have an attorney present at your trial. The Seventh Amendment gives you the right to a jury trial in a civil case involving money. The Eighth Amendment says no cruel or unusual punishment or excessive bails and fines. The Ninth Amendment states that citizens have some rights that are not listed in the Constitution, but they still have them. And the 10th Amendment is pretty much if the government doesn't make a decision on it and it's not expressly forbidden by the Constitution, the states get the right to decide, and that's part of the federalistic principles of the Constitution, or that shared power between the national, which is the federal, and the state governments. All right. So after the Constitution is ratified, Washington is unanimously elected president, and he's not a subject matter expert on everything, so he has to create a cabinet of advisors, and he has a few of them. Two of the chief ones that we're going to talk about were the Secretary of State, who is Thomas Jefferson. His job is like all things dealing with foreign countries. And then we have the Secretary of the Treasury, who is Alexander Hamilton, and he's in charge of getting the nation's finances on track. Now, these two, they don't really like each other, but we're gonna make that pretty apparent, and it creates some pretty big tensions in the early days of the Republic. So let's just talk about it. Hamilton had to find a way to get the U.S. out of debt, so he created a financial plan that was pretty good. He says the federal government will assume every state's debt. So you're going to take New York debt and Virginia debt and Georgia debt and Maryland debt, and you're going to put them all into one big pot. and then you're going to create a national bank, and with these two, you're going to pay everything off. But you're also going to put a tax on whiskey, because what we used to call the middle colonies, the ones that were rich in like rye and grains and all those things, they're used to make whiskey. And there's an abundance of whiskey coming out of this area. It says, hey, we need to tax that. So the U.S. government puts a tax on whiskey, and then he offers up this protective tariff. But Jefferson opposes Hamilton's financial plan, and they just have this ongoing feud with each other, and it leads to the formation of the very first political parties. So Thomas Jefferson forms the Democratic Republicans, Alexander Hamilton, the Federalists. And so now we have a two-party system in the United States, and it's all a little crazy. But let's backtrack to the whiskey. So the whiskey tax really ticks off some Americans, especially in Western Pennsylvania, and they refuse to pay the tax, and they call themselves the Whiskey Rebels, and they make a flag and everything about it. And so Washington, seeing this, says, hey, I need to take this opportunity to prove that the U.S. government is strong enough to handle its internal businesses. This is an internal struggle. And so the Whiskey Rebellion is kind of crazy, because Washington actually is the only president to ever lead an army on the field. And what he does is he saddles up and he gets the army and he starts marching towards Pennsylvania. And what do you know? The Pennsylvanians say, hey, we'll pay our taxes. And so this proves that the Constitution works and the U.S. government has enough clout to be able to enforce its laws, and it is strong enough. So that was the Whiskey Rebellion. And after 2 terms as president, George Washington decides he's not going to run for re-election. He says this is just one of the things that he does. We call them precedents. He was the first to do it because he was the first president. So he set the precedent for future presidents to serve no more than 2 terms. Now, that doesn't become a constitutional law until way later, but it did. Every president from then on until Franklin Delano Roosevelt only served 2 terms. John Adams takes the reins after Washington goes into retirement, and that's the story so far. We will pick it back up right after the break. Good luck on your test, guys.